My great-grandfather was the first Irish Catholic mayor of Boston. The first, let me put it this way, Irish Catholic ghetto mayor. There was one mayor before him that was Irish Catholic, but he was chosen by the Brahmins. And he was the first one who was, part of the rebellion of the Irish. And the ultimate takeover of Boston and many of our other urban areas by Irish Catholic politicians. My grandfather, John Fitzgerald, was called Honey Fitz because he had a beautiful singing voice that sounded like honey. And his contemporary, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, was a state legislature and a political boss in Boston. Their children married. Rose Fitzgerald married my grandfather. Joseph Kennedy, he was the treasurer for Franklin Roosevelt's campaign. He was the only Wall Street figure who supported Roosevelt. And then he became the first commissioner of the SEC. He had political ambitions of his own, but he ruined those ambitions by his anti-war position, both in World War I and then World War II. He served as the U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James under Roosevelt to Great Britain. And then his children, his son Joe, who was killed during the war, gave a speech, would have run, and my grandfather had ambitions for him to be the first Irish Catholic president. He spoke, gave a keynote address at the Democratic Convention in 1940. My uncle, John Kennedy, became the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. My father served as Attorney General in the United States Senate and then died, was assassinated in his own run for president. My uncle, Ted Kennedy, was the second longest serving member of the United States Senate. And so, my family, the DNA of the Democratic Party was baked into my own character, my identity. I grew up in the party. I began campaigning when I was 6 years old on my uncle's campaign. I attended the convention in Los Angeles that year, and I've attended almost every Democratic convention since then. Worked in probably 100 campaigns. And I was a stalwart in the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party that I grew up with changed dramatically, has changed the last year. The Democratic Party I grew up in was the party of peace. My uncle, John Kennedy, he was asked by his best friend, one of his two best friends, Ben Bradley, who was then the editor of Washington Post, what do you want on your gravestone? And without skipping a beat, my uncle said he kept the peace. He said the primary job of a president of the United States was to keep the country out of war. Mm-hmm. He said he didn't want children in Africa and Latin America, when they heard about the United States, to think about a man in a military uniform with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Kennedy Milk Program, which provided nutrition to millions of malnourished kids around the world. He wanted them to think of USAID, of Alliance for Progress, and these other programs that my uncle created to project economic power rather than military power abroad. My uncle was under tremendous pressure to go to war in Laos, which he resisted in 1961, to go to war in Germany during the Checkpoint Charlie crisis in 62, to go to war against Cuba in 61 during the Bay of Pigs, and then again in 63 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then to go to Vietnam. Virtually all of his advisors were telling him he had to send 250,000 troops to Vietnam or the government was collapsed, and he said, it's their government. We cannot fight their war for them. He ultimately, under great pressure, sent 16,000 military advisors, and then who were not, under his rules of engagement, allowed to participate in combat. Some of them did. In October of 1963, he learned that a Green Beret had been killed in Vietnam. And he turned to his aide, Walt Rostow, and he said, I want the casualties, a complete list of casualties, of U.S. casualties. Rostow came back to him an hour later and there was 76 Americans that died at that point. My uncle said it's too many. And that afternoon, this October 22nd, 1963, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all military personnel, U.S. military personnel, out of Vietnam by 1965, with the first 1,000 coming home by December. So that would have been 6 weeks later. And then he was killed 30 days to the date after he signed that order. And a week after that, President Johnson, his successor, remanded National Security Order 263. Johnson then sent 265,000 Americans to Vietnam. It became our war. My father ran against that war in 1968, and he also was killed in that process. And then Nixon took over and sent 560,000 Americans to Vietnam. We killed 1 million of them, maybe 2 million. They killed 56,000 of our children, including my cousin George Skakel, who died in the Tet Offensive. And America then went down a different path toward becoming a feature of the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower had warned against 3 days before on my birthday in 1961. 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, Eisenhower made that warning, and my uncle spent 3,000 days of his presidency keeping us out of war and keeping the military-industrial complex at bay. This was one of the defining features of the Democratic Party. We were the party that was against war. The Republicans were the pro-war party. We were the party that was for civil rights, including constitutional rights, and particularly freedom of speech, which is the backstop for all the other rights of the United States Constitution. A country that has the capacity to censor its critics has the license for every kind of atrocity. My father understood that. My uncle understood that. That was a bedrock assumption of the Democratic Party, that free speech was, if any constrictions on free speech, was the first step down the slippery slope of totalitarianism.
Is it fair to say then that you found the Democrats, and at the present time, you've alluded to peace, and under Trump,
they're now the party of war. They're now, they're about to get us into a war with Russia.